So it is a huge pleasure to introduce Dr. Tatiana Gumucio, who is a cultural anthropologist in the Department of Geography at Penn State. She received her PhD and her master's in anthropology from the University of Florida, and she earned undergraduate degrees in international relations and economics from the University of Pennsylvania. She was previously a postdoctoral research scientist at Columbia University, and her research, which spans not multiple continents and multiple countries, focuses on the influence of gender, ethnicity, and race on smallholder farmers' risk perceptions, climate information needs, and capabilities to respond and adapt to climate variability and change. So without further ado, Tatiana, I will hand this over to you and let you share your screen and put up any slides that you may want to use. And if everyone, as we go along, if you have questions, please put them into the chat and I will curate them at the end. Thank you so much.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot, Michelle. So I've started sharing my screen. Let me know if that doesn't work. Yes, thanks again for that really nice introduction. And I'm really pleased to be with you all this afternoon to share a bit about a few of the research projects that I've been involved in related to weather and climate risk management for rural livelihoods in East Africa. I'm a postdoctoral scholar, as Michelle mentioned, in the geography department at Penn State. And I'd just like to highlight that I'll be sharing a couple of snapshots of results from each of the projects. Each one of them is very different. However, they all fall broadly under the category of weather and climate risk management. I hope that together they are thought-provoking and look forward to discussion with you all after the talk. And I'll say it's really nice in being able to see people's videos. That's nice. I think I've been in other webinars where it feels a bit more impersonal looking out over just seeing myself in the screen. So this is really nice. But just wanted to give a brief preview of what I'll be going over in the talk today. First, I'll just be sharing some brief background on how we understand climate-related risk management and adaptation, and then also why a focus on gender and social inequalities is particularly important and helpful for this type of research. And then I'll be getting into the meat of the talk, which has to do with insights from, it says 3 projects there, but actually it's more like 2. One that focuses on Uganda and a risk spectrum analysis for adoption of drought-tolerant maize varieties, and another that has to do with climate services for agriculture in Rwanda. And then I'll wrap up with a few key takeaways that I've observed, but again, I'll look forward to your feedback and comments. So first, getting into how we understand climate-related risk, and then what are the implications for sub-Saharan African societies. We understand that extreme events such as droughts, floods, and high temperatures can have a detrimental effect on communities through destruction of their livelihood assets. Oftentimes communities will resort to selling their major assets like land or big livestock to be able to cope with the effects of extreme weather events also. But in addition to this, the uncertainty of climate variability, meaning not knowing when the rains will start this season and then not knowing for sure how long they will last, is a disincentive to investing in agricultural innovation. Looking at the context of farming in sub-Saharan Africa, a lot of it is based on rain-fed agriculture and carried out by small-scale farming or subsistence farmers. So with all this in mind, research focusing on risk management strategies is particularly important to help promote sustainable strategies that don't push farmers further into a poverty trap, and that also provide guidance for initiatives that help farmers manage climate variability and adapt to change. Now, in the context of this type of research, why or how is it important to think about gender considerations? Well, first off, it's important to recognize that farmers, they're not a homogeneous group. They will have different experiences of extreme weather events and of environmental change due to several social identity variables. Uh, Related to gender, a significant one, we know that gender can influence concerns and risks perceived by women and men, due in part to the roles and responsibilities that they carry out in their everyday management of their livelihoods, in their households, and their communities. In addition, we know that gender-specific roles in agriculture condition women's and men's knowledge of farming. This all influences the risk management strategies in which they engage. Differences in agency and opportunities also influence women's and men's needs and preferences for agricultural technologies and services. Because of differences related to gender, for example, women and men have differing control over productive resources like land, key assets, key agricultural equipment. Also, because of differences related to gender, men and women can have differing control or voice in decision-making processes. For example, decisions related to what type of crop should be cultivated this season, or how should the land be used for our household this particular season. Oftentimes, perhaps men can have more control over certain decisions like this. And then finally, it's important to have a good understanding of the local normative structures surrounding gender and how this can influence differences in agency and opportunities. And when I'm referring to normative structures, just talking about those kind of social rules or customary norms concerning, for example, who ought to be carrying out what activities and roles, what places and spaces are most appropriate to certain social groups. And here, before going any further, also, I'd just like to highlight how it's important to understand that gender intersects with other social identity variables. So going back to what was mentioned earlier about how farmers aren't a homogeneous group, similarly, male farmers aren't one homogeneous group and female farmers aren't one homogeneous group either. Just thinking about, say, a male farmer of a certain social status or social caste, they might experience, say, an extreme drought in the region very differently from another male farmer who is perhaps of a lower social status or caste. So it's important to take into account how these identity variables intersect and influence a people's experience of environmental change. So with all this said, then I'd like to take us to a couple projects that I've been involved in, and apply this perspective. These projects have to do with supporting farmers and other rural populations vulnerable to weather and climate risks to better manage that risk for their enhanced food security and general resiliency. And I'd like to start with a project in Uganda that I've been involved in. It had to do with carrying out an analysis of risk perceptions of different farm communities in 3 districts in Uganda, with the purpose of understanding how these risk perceptions can influence the strategies that they engage in to manage these risks, and then also how this can influence their needs and preferences for agricultural technologies, in this case, drought-tolerant maize. The project was led by Wageningen University, based in the Netherlands, and it was supported by the CGIAR research program for climate change, agriculture, and food security. And I'd just like to explain a bit more about the motivation and background for this project. Well, I'm sure many of you are aware already that maize, it's an important crop for both commercial and subsistence purposes in Uganda. And the interest in drought-tolerant maize varieties comes from being able to help farmers maintain production despite extreme weather events. So thus the interest in knowing more about a farmer's proclivity or tendency to want to use drought-tolerant maize varieties. So this study that I'll be talking about is kind of part of a larger project that had to do with identifying barriers and opportunities for adoption of drought-tolerant maize. But this particular study, it was an exploratory study that based itself on several different participatory action research tools. These were carried out through focus groups with men and women separately in Masindi, Dokolo, and Iganga districts in Uganda, leading to 24 focus groups total being carried out. And another important aspect of this project was the interest in being able to, well, making sure to take into account district-specific differences with the understanding that gender relations are very context-specific and can vary according to the location and context as well. And so for the project, we were interested in understanding the various different types of risks that farmers confront and manage in their everyday lives. This, again, with the recognition that farmers aren't able to just think about one risk at a time. It's usually their decisions are made based upon their management of several at the same time. So with this in mind, we tried to use a kind of a relatively broad categorization of the types of risks that farmers might confront or perceive for their livelihood management. And here, these categories that I'm displaying now are developed based on past agricultural studies on risks that farmers or agricultural actors confront. We've also, however, adopted it to the needs and focus of this research project that was focusing on smallholder farmers. And just going over the categories a bit right now, you'll see that we have 5 main categories and broken down into subcategories as well. The first one, having to do with production risks, comprises the subcategories of input risks, of those risks that have to do with seed and other agricultural inputs. And the second subcategory that has to do with weather, biological, and environmental related risks. For the rest of the talk, I tend to refer to this subcategory as just a climate-related risk. The second main category has to do with market risks, which we broke down into the 2 subcategories of logistical and infrastructural risks, and then price risks. The third main category that has to do with personal risks, we broke down into the subcategories of health risk, and then social risks and cultural norms. And this latter subcategory, we decided to add and include based on the farmers' responses during the focus groups. This was a risk that was voiced significantly and frequently, and it often had to do with risks related to community conflicts or household conflicts. And we recognize that these types of relationships in the community and with the household definitely influence livelihood management. The fourth main category had to do with financial risks, and we broke that down into risk associated with levels of poverty. This subcategory also we decided to add and include, also given farmers' reference and discussion of this as a particular concern in their lives during the focus groups. And again, we recognize that risk associated with poverty level can make agricultural investment choices riskier from a livelihoods perspective. And then the second subcategory there for financial risk has to do with access to credit. And the last main category has to do with institutional risks. And these would include risk related to public policy as well. Now, for the particular exercise that we use to start to identify and understand the farmers' risk perceptions, we asked farmers to discuss the main problems that they experience in providing for their families. And here in this figure, you'll see the responses from men's focus groups and women's focus groups per each of the districts in Dokolo, Iganga, and Masindi. And in general, there were some kind of broad trends looking at the results grossly. In particular, we see that poverty-related risks, the pink bars, and climatological risk, the red bars, were discussed quite frequently in the focus groups. However, when we start to look at a bit more, I guess, micro level, looking at district-specific trends, we do see some interesting types of outliers. In particular, we note that the women's focus groups in Masindi district discuss quite frequently risks related to cultural norms and social risks. Oftentimes when they discussed this type of risk, it had to do with problems related to domestic violence and marital tensions. Another a district-specific trend that we noted also was that in the district of Iganga, there were some substantial differences between women's and men's focus groups and their responses. In particular here, you see that men's focus group mentioned quite frequently risk related to poverty more than women. And then in comparison, women's focus groups actually mentioned climatological risks more frequently in comparison to the men's focus groups in Iganga. Now, as a second step in this exercise, we asked the farmers to rank the risks that they had mentioned in accordance to their importance for their livelihood management, with a rank of 1 being most important and rank of 5 the least important. And here you'll see actually in the figure that we kind of aggregated the subcategories of risks into the larger 5 main categories. Again, here we can see some kind of that a broad trend of that men's and women's groups may have been similar in their responses, recognizing risks and concerns related to personal and financial risks high across all ranks. There are some interesting gender differences. In particular, we see that men's groups tended to give financial concerns a higher rank than women. And here we see, in fact, that several men's groups gave financial risks a rank of 1 or 2, while women, much less women did. Then in addition, we see that concerning production risk, and production risks included those subcategories of climatological related risks and input risk, women tended to rank this type of risk with more priority, with more importance, more frequently than men did. And again, you can see here that women's groups gave production risk a rank of 1 or 2 more frequently than men's focus groups did. And it's interesting to compare these results with other information that we collected through other of the tools that used in the exploratory study. For example, there were some tools that collected information related to women's and men's roles in their household and in their community, and it was it was highlighted in those discussions, men's significant role as breadwinner for the household, men having control over cash income more so than women. And with this in mind, it can be seen how this could be a factor in influencing how financial risks could be felt more acutely by men's focus groups more than women in some cases. Also, from those additional exercises and tools that were used in the study, the role of food preparation and home care and its association with women's responsibilities was highlighted. And with this in mind, and considering the needs for having constant access to water, and how climatological events could have an influence on capacities to be able to prepare and serve meals and take care of the home, could also be an important influence on some of the results that we're seeing here as well. That said, I would like to highlight that it's not that financial risks were never a concern for women at all, or that risks related to extreme weather events or to climate weren't a concern at all for men. They both men and women definitely discussed both of these. Here, just kind of pointing out some variations in the trends, looking kind of at a more nuanced level of analysis as well. So then getting into a third step of this exercise was then we asked farmers to discuss the strategies that they use for managing the types of risks that they had identified. And here I'm just showing a couple examples of the strategies that they noticed, and for just a few of the categories of risks that they talked about. So, for example, for risks related to climate, we see that women had discussed storing food and borrowing food or money or water from neighbors. Also, in order to manage risks related to inputs, we see that women, they tend to discuss a bit more substantially than men, borrowing seed and agro inputs from their neighbors. When it came to risks related to health, there were some interesting gender trends, with men mentioning how getting vaccinated can help manage or reduce the health risks, whereas women tended to highlight using community health services. And then related to poverty-related risks, which again, this had been a risk that had been noted significantly during the focus group discussions, as mentioned previously. There were some similarities in the types of strategies that women and men discussed. In particular, both women and men discussed engaging in casual labor to manage this type of risk. And they also mentioned borrowing from neighbors in order to manage poverty-related risks. Men in particular, and women not so much, discussed selling livestock and other assets in order to manage poverty-related risks. So just kind of stepping back a bit from the results and to observe what can be gleaned as far as kind of larger trends or takeaways. It's and this is actually something that we're getting into more as we're analyzing the data from all the exercises that were carried out with the different participatory action research tools and learning more from the evidence base. But it can seem that women's strategies might be more short-term in comparison to men. And they might also be indicative of the opportunities that are available to them. For example, in the case of women, their neighbors or in social network, the resources within their community. And again, it's interesting to note for women what seemed to be the importance of the effects of climate-related risks on food security. And then taking a kind of further step backward to think about the significance of these results for the larger project objectives, it would seem that both women and men farmers might lack institutional risk management strategies, and they rely on their own household labor and their personal community resources in order to manage risks. What gets highlighted also is that their perceived financial risks, how significant they are to them, might be a real barrier to their adopting drought-tolerant maize. However, what we're starting to learn from some of the study's results are there are some opportunities that would lie, for example, in what we're learning about how women and men, they both participate significantly in seed sourcing, meaning deciding what type of seed to use for maize cultivation, understanding which type of seed would be most beneficial for their household, for their household's livelihood activities or livelihood management. And so harnessing and engaging with that knowledge that women and men have of the seeds that they use and that are important for maize cultivation in their portfolio of their livelihood management will be important in order to provide additional information on the benefits of drought-tolerant maize and how that might be beneficial to their households. So this is something that we're looking into more. I think I noticed this might be new to me. That I noticed there's a raised hand. Do you all pause or? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, I'm getting used to using the different platforms, Zoom and Teams and otherwise. But yes, no. So these are some of the things we're learning from the project in Uganda. I would like to transfer and discuss a bit about what we're learning from a project that I've been involved in Rwanda. And this project focused on climate services for agriculture. And what this is getting at has to do with being able to generate and provide information about weather and climate, weather statistics, climate forecasts that are really useful for the agricultural sector in Rwanda. So the project had two main aims. One having to do with building the capacity of the country's national institutions to provide climate information for the agricultural sector. So this meant working with the National Meteorological Services in Rwanda and other national institutions who might have the responsibility of providing meteorological information, weather information to the public to be able to better use information freely available from satellites to be able to generate important and useful weather statistics and forecasts for the country. But a second aim of the project had to do with helping farmers to effectively use the information for their farm management decisions. And it's this aim that I'd like to focus on for the talk today. And also just like to point out and acknowledge as well, this project was funded through USAID and was also supported by the CGIAR Research Program for Climate Change, Agriculture, and Food Security. So in order to carry out this goal of helping farmers to effectively use weather and climate information in their farm management, the project focused on a couple of main interventions. One had to do with what was called PICSA, which is a training program. The acronym stands for Participatory Integrated Climate Services for Agriculture, but it's basically a series of modules that kind of walk groups of farmers through several exercises to that helps them to integrate local historical and forecast climate information with decision-making tools to help build their capacity to make climate-informed decisions. Farmer promoters in Rwanda were trained in PICSA, and farmer promoters are kind of key contacts who play an important role in Rwanda's national extension services. Farmer promoters work with local groups of farmers across Rwanda's 30 districts on agricultural training and advising. So these farmer promoters were trained in the PICSA process, and the farmer promoters worked with farmers to train them in PICSA as well. And then a second type of intervention had to do with radio listeners clubs. And these were groups of farmers who met on a weekly basis to listen to an agricultural education program that included information about the weather, climate-related information for the particular season. And so during these weekly meetings, farmers would listen to the program, discuss what they had gleaned from the program, and also discuss together the types of actions and plans that they would plan to implement on their own farms based on what they had been learning from the program that week. So this project in Rwanda was carried out over 2016 to 2020, and it was near the end of 2019 that an evaluation of the project was carried out. There were a couple components of the evaluation. I'll be discussing particularly the evaluation's qualitative component that I was involved in. And the qualitative evaluation sought to assess gender differences in use of climate information in farm and non-farm livelihood decision-making as a result of the project's interventions. A second main objective of the evaluation was to seek to analyze gender differences and benefits from those improved management decisions. And then another objective of the evaluation was to assess the effects of project interventions on women's participation in household decision-making processes. So this qualitative evaluation was carried out through gender-segregated focus group discussions and semi-structured interviews. So female facilitators facilitated all women focus groups and vice versa, male facilitators working with male farmer focus groups, etc. And so this was carried out with a total of 32 focus groups, and a total of 24 semi-structured interviews were carried out representing Rwanda's 4 provinces. And I'd like to share what our initial results from that evaluation. We'll be continuing to analyze the results and findings to kind of tease them out more robustly, but I think it's still useful and interesting to go over some of the initial results that that we've gleaned so far from the study. In particular, so when women and men farmers were asked to discuss how or if they were using climate and weather information in their crop management, what we found was that men might be using climate information for these decisions kind of more commonly in comparison to women. However, there is evidence that that the interventions were able to contribute to women's use of climate information in a couple of major decisions related to crop management. One in crop selection and the other in variety selection. And these differences in or kind of gender-related trends in how women and men might use the climate information most likely has to do also with the roles that men and women play in agricultural decision-making in rural communities in Rwanda, where men can have a primary role in these types of decisions or have more of a final say. However, it is interesting to see that the interventions were able to contribute to women using climate information more for crop and variety selection. In particular, women discussed using information on total seasonal rainfall amount and on length of season for their decisions. For instance, they discussed cultivating cassava when a short season was forecasted and planting maize when a high rainfall season was forecasted. And here you see a quote from one of the women's focus groups from Eastern Province. These were women who had received the PICSA training in 2016 at the beginning of the project, where they explained that they cultivated cassava because they had heard that the rainfall would be low for the season. Now, when we get into results related to livestock management, it was found that the interventions promoted women's and men's use of climate information in fodder preparation. And in particular, women explained that they would use the information to plan on planting grass during the rainy season and storing it to be used for fodder for livestock ahead of the dry season. And here we see this quote here illustrating this result, where a women's focus group from the northern province, these were women who had been trained in PICSA in 2016, discussed using information for fodder management. Now, something more specific to men, it was found that men used the information for decisions related to reducing livestock. For example, they discussed using dry season forecasts to decide to reduce their numbers of livestock by a sale or shared ownership with a neighbor, so they would be able to provide enough food for the livestock under their care. And again, here it can be helpful to consider gender roles in agriculture. Often it can be that women and men are both involved in fodder preparation or in the providing food for livestock, whereas men might have a more primary role in decisions to reduce or sell livestock in comparison to women, in particular in those situations where men might be the primary owners of large livestock, say. Now, when it came to discussing with farmers about the benefits that they perceived from those climate-informed decisions that they had made, it was found that interventions contributed to women's increased confidence in planning. For example, they discussed having more confidence in their farm planning and invested more in their agricultural and livestock activities. They also remarked that because of their climate-informed planning, such as timing of planting, erosion control, and pesticide application, maintaining waterways to prevent damage to the home, and repairing animal shelters, that they were better prepared for the effects of extreme climate events. They were also able to prepare for forecasted hard times by preparing, by storing food and saving money. Men in particular discussed benefits that they perceived related to increased livestock production. For example, they explained that they had increased manure and milk from their livestock because they had been prepared to provide their livestock food from their household's agricultural production and from their timely fodder management. Now, when we look to those results that were related to the effects of interventions on women's participation in decision-making, there has been some evidence that the interventions contributed to women's enhanced role in agricultural planning. And how did this come about? Well, we're learning that the trainings related to climate-informed decision-making may have helped women to voice their ideas on farm management more confidently in discussions with their spouses or with other household members. And this enabled them to participate more in agricultural decision-making. Also, in some cases, women discussed experience enhanced standing and recognition as providers for their families. And this would come about through their implementing the plans that they were able to make through the trainings that they had received, basically acting on and implementing these climate-informed plans, and those actions having positive results, for example, related to having increased yields. And here, there's a quote from a women's focus group from Northern Province, from women who had been trained in PICSA in 2016, where the women had explained that if your plan fails, even a child will not trust you and refuse your ideas. And this is just kind of getting at the importance of, well, kind of the converse. If your plan, if your planning on your farm is successful, then that really does gain the recognition and notice of your other family members, and can also help with this recognition for women as providers for their families, whereas it might not have been recognized as much previously. So all of this said, I would like to highlight that we understand and are trying to more critically analyze also the normative environment in which these changes were occurring. For example, we're understanding that in Rwanda, in rural communities, it can be common for both women and men to participate together in agricultural decision making, although men tend to play a lead role, having, say, the final say on what is decided. And so this this can be an important element already in place, that allowed for the trainings on climate-informed decision making to facilitate that women participate more or play more of a significant role in those decision-making processes. And this is all kind of getting at the importance also of understanding what are those kind of social customary norms concerning who ought to be playing what role in the household livelihood management, and understanding a bit more about aspects related to male resistance to change that might go against the norm. And this quote that's displayed here it can be a helpful example of that, where a women's focus group who had been trained in both PICSA and who had also participated in the Radio Listeners Club in Eastern Province had mentioned, sometimes if we take decisions, our husbands tell us that we've become men. So again, understanding that normative environment and what roles are more or less appropriate for men and women, and how rigid those roles might be, as far as allowing change to occur, that can be important for understanding some of the results that we've been seeing as well. So just summing up a bit, as I understand, shared a couple different disparate results from that study in Rwanda, just trying to pull together things a bit. Because what we're learning from that qualitative evaluation in the project in Rwanda is that men might be in a better position to use and benefit from climate information in comparison to women. In this talk, I tried to focus a bit on those results that highlight instances where women were using climate information more because of the interventions, but actually something that was seen across the study and across the types of uses of climate information was that men, perhaps more consistently than women, were making use of the climate information more so than women. And this imbalance or this tendency can be due to factors like those mentioned at the beginning of the talk today, related to voice and decision-making processes and the local normative structures surrounding gender. However, something that the study suggests also is that capacity building that intentionally includes women can help close those equity gaps. Something that I should mention is that those interventions related to the PICSA trainings, related to the radio listeners clubs, sought to ensure that women were represented equally in the trainings and in the listeners clubs. So this at least helped with making sure that, or helped to promote that women were at least accessing those trainings and capacity building activities. Learning more about that process can be helpful for learning about how to promote more resilient communities in general. However, additional research on the enabling environment is definitely necessary. So now, taking a further step back and seeking to pull out some takeaways from across the two studies. I think the two studies together, although again both different with different objectives and different. One looking at kind of an exploratory study in Uganda, one looking at evaluation of a project, an evaluation happening at the very end of a project. There are some significance of the findings that maybe we can use for more food for thought. One related to gender and risk perceptions, or perhaps gendered risk perceptions, and how understanding how gender can influence risk perceptions is important for being able to identify opportunities and barriers to adoption of risk-reducing agricultural technologies. In the case of the Uganda project, of course, it had to do with drought-tolerant maize in particular. And the studies, I think, also highlight the importance of gender for assessing outcomes and impacts of climate services related to household well-being and also empowerment. And again, just highlighting about how women and men both comprise what is the household. The household isn't just this kind of one unitary entity. it's necessary to understand women's and men's risk perceptions and their corresponding needs and preferences for services and technologies. And this is important in order to promote initiatives that benefit both women and men and to contribute to enhanced resilience for the household and the community. And so with that, I would like to wrap up. And again, say thank you for the opportunity to be sharing with you some of these initial results from these different projects. And I look forward to your feedback and discussion.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tatiana. That was a fantastic, or such a rich and interesting talk. Maybe if you could, yeah, stop sharing your screen and we'll bring everyone back up. Hello, everyone's Zoom box is back. And I will, yeah, I just think you have done such a great job to take us to two different country contexts, and then within each one to share with us findings from multiple regions, which is a real treasure you don't often get to hear about in a talk. So thank you very much for your presentation. I have a few questions, but I know Abdurrahman, you had your hand up halfway through. So if you want to ask your question, you could go ahead and do that. And everyone else, feel free to put your questions into the chat. And if you would like to then speak it out loud, I would welcome that. Get actual more interpersonal interactions here. Abdurrahman, do you want to go ahead?
No, she already answered my question. It was about the homogeneous group of the farmers. And,
oh, okay.
It was
okay.
clear. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Christina, I see your hand. Thank you.
Tatiana, thank you for that wonderful talk. It was really interesting. I was wondering if you could speak about maybe what kind of balance you have to strike as a researcher coming in and looking at these particular contexts with a critical lens, given the development work that's being done, and not so much your relationship vis-a-vis communities, but your relationship may be more vis-a-vis organizations like USAID. I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what that dynamic is like for you in this context.
Sure. No, thank you. That's I appreciate that question. I should maybe highlight also, I think in those projects, I wasn't the PI for the project. I was kind of a postdoc carrying out a particular component or of the activity for the research. So I think with that in mind, I might have been a bit distanced from the contact or negotiating or the relationship with the funder because of that. I think I guess I could say just in comparison to other projects I've been involved in, like the one I am currently actually in the geography department, where it's I feel like it's perhaps as far as researchers being able to engage a learning process that has even an influence on, say, donors. It's been from my own limited experience, it's been much more fruitful when it's a smaller project and for example, the project I'm on right now in the geography department, we have a weekly meeting with the donors and where we get to talk about updates, and it's kind of you can kind of see perhaps how your developing research findings can have more of an influence, say, on institutional change of a donor, and so I would say that I don't know if that's answering so much your question, but yes, I think in other projects per se, it might be very large, funded by a donor like USAID. It's you can feel a little bit, I guess, very small as one researcher on a project, and and being able to give significant feedback to the donor that goes beyond just like the report that you handed to them at the end of the project. It's yeah, no, you wonder a bit about about your effects on I guess on donor mindset or thinking about how to invest their funds in the future. So yes, I'm not sure I responded exactly to your question though.
No, thank you. That's a good perspective to hear. So it just sounds like from what you're saying that a lot of it is based on the particular project and basically forging relationships with individuals, within the project so that maybe if you have smaller projects, you can build more of those kind of lateral relationships that don't necessarily get routed through the larger institution in some way. And maybe those are more effective for promoting dialogue and potentially, suggesting changes or approaches or new directions. So that's very interesting. Thank you.
Oh, sure. I'm glad it was helpful.
Bronwyn, I see your hand is up.
Hi, Tatiana. What a wonderful presentation. Thank you. Following on Christina's question, I also perceive that governments and donors have a very significant focus on grain production. And in many places, there's a division where grain and staple is the responsibility of men and everything else is the responsibility of women. So fruits and vegetables are women's domain and women's responsibility. And because priorities for funding and extension projects are so controlled by male policymakers and male decision makers, there has historically been one of the arguments made for why there's historically little intervention in fruits and vegetables is that it's gendered. I'm doing one of those. I have a question, but it's really a comment. I had a question and it's gone from my brain. Right. So how, in terms of that intersection between gender and climate change and gender and climate change risk, do in your projects, do women talk about fruits and vegetables? And how do you get beyond the obsession with grain and income and protecting that from climate change risk in your projects?
Sure. No. Yes. Thank you for that. For those comments and for that question, Bronwyn. I think it's a really helpful question also, because I think I can recognize it and appreciate it. That yes, the perhaps overemphasis sometimes on these male associated types of crops for these projects promoting food security. Actually from these projects that I was discussing, I think it might have to, like, for example, the one from Uganda, it had such a strong focus on maize in particular. I believe that if the research activities had been structured differently, if some of the tools had been structured a bit differently, perhaps there would have been more discussion of different types of crops, and perhaps we would have seen that more. I will say also that the particular districts that were chosen for the project, they were chosen purposefully, and I probably should have mentioned that at the beginning. They were chosen because they tended to be districts where maize cultivation was very significant, or maize cultivation was kind of up and coming. It was growing more and more, and so again, perhaps if different types of districts had been selected, there would have been a discussion of different types of crops, and I think actually remembering the results kind of more in detail. There was discussion of fruits and vegetables, but I think something that came out of it was that it was a bit expensive to cultivate, or at least it was a bit riskier, and required a bit more knowledge of I guess specific farming practices to have good substantial yields from those types of fruits and vegetables. I'm not being able to remember right now which fruits and vegetables they were exactly, but that was something that came up. It again, I'm not sure that perhaps the types of fruits and vegetables that were being talked about in that context were the type that were that perhaps weren't so indigenous to those districts and were a bit more challenging to cultivate. And then so that in particular did come up in the Uganda project. And the Rwanda project, I'm not able to, I think I would have to look back at the information some more to see what was said about other types of crops besides some of these more staple ones like maize and yucca and, excuse me, cassava and beans. But yes, no, thank you. That's a really helpful and important question to consider.
Thanks very much. All right, I think David, your hand was up first, and then we'll come to some of the questions in the chat.
Thank you for speaking with us today, Tatiana. That was very informative. I was curious about PICSA. Would you mind elaborating more about how it works and what makes it effective?
Sure. Thanks. And I could actually probably provide a couple of links to some of the, there's a manual for carrying out PICSA that exists, and I could share that later as well. But yes, PICSA was developed by the University of Reading, and it's been carried out in a couple, well, more than a couple, several countries in sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America as well. But I myself, I'll try to explain as best as I can. But if you would be interested in more detailed information too, I'd be happy to put you in touch with the folks at the University of Reading who developed the PICSA process. But basically, it has to do with working with groups of farmers in and the kind of a basic tenet that it's tries to follow is understanding kind of their local context and being able to introduce and integrate information related to weather and climate into their local context of decision making and livelihood management. So there's a series of modules starting from, for example, understanding their resource base and going to understanding introducing and discussing with them probabilities and weather probabilities, and then also getting into managing a budget, managing their household farming budget, using some of the information that they're learning about climate and weather risk. And so it's a series of modules like that, but it's supposed to be accessible to all types of farmers, regardless of literacy levels. And so those are some of the basic characteristics about it. But I could share more information. There have been some publications on PICSA, and as I mentioned, if depending on your interest, could actually put you in touch with the University of Reading folks who are usually more than happy to talk about PICSA also.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I'd love to learn more. If you could connect me as well, that'd be great. Thank you.
Sure.
It's awesome. Despite Zoom, through Zoom, we're connecting people. And I think your question in the chat came next. Would you like to ask it? Or I could read it out, whatever you prefer.
Sure, I'm happy to ask it. First of all, thanks, Tatiana. Really, really nice presentation. Very interesting. I'm curious if you can make connections between the two studies, the two topics. For example, women's decision-making authority or power and gender differences in risk of identification. Do you see any kinds of connections between those two factors?
Oh, sure. No, thank you and for that question, Anne, and it's good to see you over Zoom. Yes, I mean, I think there are often, after the fact, after a study has been carried out, you look back on methodologically what you would have liked to change or include. For example, the study in Rwanda, we didn't actually include information gathering that had to do with risk perception, but it would have been interesting and looking back on things now to learn more about kind of that change pathway and to what extent the actions or decisions that women and men were able to implement, to what extent that had to do with their risk perceptions. So for the Rwanda study, I didn't really have specific information related to that to look back to. I would say for the Uganda study, yes, that also was an exploratory study that eventually the information from that study would like to inform what would be, say, an intervention that would have to do with agricultural insurance and drought and promotion or dissemination of drought-tolerant maize varieties. And so it would be interesting if once a project like that is implemented to then evaluate of those farmers who did adopt the drought tolerant maize and make use of the insurance bundled with it. What did that have to do with the risk perceptions that we had assessed or identified in the exploratory study to begin with? But yes, so those are connections that would be that one would hope, or that would be interesting to make as that particular project progresses.
Even speculatively, I mean, I was struck by that quote about if you I can't remember exactly what the premise was, but you turn into a man. If you make too many decisions, you turn into a man. I'm wondering if that it follows through in terms of turning into a man in terms of the ways they perceive risk.
Sure. No. I guess I guess adding to that comment that you just made, I know it's come up before too that well, something that's noted in the Uganda study, and I think it's come up in another research I've seen in Mali, is that for women there might be a real risk related to perhaps stepping out of their bounds or their socially defined role and having to deal with male resistance or which might be violent sometimes, and so that's also a risk that they have to keep in mind or manage when they're considering the options available to them as far as livelihood investment choices. So it's interesting. I guess just I hadn't thought about it until right now, until you mentioned it. But that might also be a significant risk for women in Rwanda. Although we didn't get too much into the issue of domestic violence or marital tensions to the extent that it came up in the focus group discussions in the Uganda project, actually.
Mike, it looks like your questions are up next on the docket. Do you want to ask them in what you said in the chat?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Thank you very much. I just in Uganda, you know, there's very fractured tribal groups, and I'm just wondering if in your discussions did the risk of losing their land and being relocated come up?
Okay, no, thank you. Thank you for that question also, Michael. That particular question didn't come up, or that particular issue didn't come up. I think it would have been, again, I guess, thinking about methodological modifications that that one would have liked to make. Thinking about it in hindsight, it would have been interesting to try and disaggregate the focus group discussions according to ethnic or tribal groups, but for given some time constraints and funding constraints also, the focus groups were kind of per district, but the groups of women and groups of men. So that issue didn't exactly come up. It did come up in different types of discussions. The concerns related to, well, kind of the historical influence of the past civil conflict and how that had affected some communities' development and their infrastructural development. So that came up a bit, but not specifically the tribal conflicts. But again, that might have to do with
What about outside investors and concern about losing their land?
Outside investors being concerned about
cash cropping, coffee investors, those kind of things in Uganda.
There had been some mention, and if I'm remembering correctly, the effects of I think and I can verify this to make sure that I'm remembering correctly, but sugarcane production and how that was a real concern for land management, because that sugarcane crop production was kind of seeping into their own lands that they had, and so that did come up, and again, I can verify that a bit more to understand better in which places in Uganda that came up.
Okay.
Well, if I could just add a question in, what stood out to me from your Uganda study with the risk perception of the Masindi women, I think it was, that they had the very high bar for social cultural risks compared to the other two groups. And so on one hand, it's interesting that they had such a high perception, but also that the other two groups didn't have that sort of sense of a social cultural risk coming to them. So I'm just wondering if maybe you could talk about that, if there was any sort of explanatory, why was that so?
Sure, yes. No, thanks for bringing that up. And I think, so for the purposes of the talk today, I had presented on results from that risk ranking tool, but actually in other tools that we used, the issue of, because within that category of social risks, a lot of what comprised it had to do with marital tensions, intra-household conflicts, and those topics came up as problems in other tools that were used, and in a few of the other districts. So if I could have given perhaps a more comprehensive perspective on the extent to which risks or problems related to marital tensions were something that women versus men were dealing with or negotiating, there would have been a bit more to be said for the other districts as well. For example, I think it was in the districts, the district of Dokolo, that women discussed the food security problems they would have sometimes, and how they're not being able to prepare food for the household would contribute to kind of escalated tension in the home and aggravation on the part of men and domestic violence sometimes. So yes, it's interesting though that like that came up in other tools, but that didn't come up so much when using the risk ranking tool. That DeColo women didn't bring this up so much. So yes, it's interesting to think about, I guess, which methods are better for eliciting responses about certain topics. But yes, I hope that information was helpful.
Yeah, no, it just struck my curiosity to see that sort of discrepancy. If I could I'll put in a shout out to Edwin Samhuru, who's just shown up on the Zoom box in person. He actually gave a talk at our previous brown bag seminar on Rwanda and conservation strategies, particularly focused on game reserves. So I just want to connect you to Edwin's jointly appointed in African Studies and the Recreation Park and Tourism Management here. So I hope that we can sort of have some cross African Studies brown bag seminar friendships.
Thanks for pointing that out, Michelle. It's good to meet you, Edwin.
Thank you. Nice to meet you, Tatiana.
I think that if there's a last chance for questions, then otherwise we are just perfectly on time. We usually end somewhere between 1:45 and 2. So I think I just want to thank everyone for showing up today, and Tatiana, especially to you for giving us such a break from Leary State College and introducing us to these fantastic case studies.
Thanks a lot for everyone who's been on the Zoom and for your questions. I really appreciated your feedback and comments and questions.
And everyone, please do come to the next African Studies seminar speaker, which should be, I believe, in 2 weeks' time. But watch, Joey is tremendous with sending out advertisements for all of these talks. So thank you so much, everybody, and look forward to seeing you all again soon.
Bye, Michelle.
Bye, Joey.
That was really good.
That
I
was
love all the lectures.
It was, yeah, it was so nice. Yeah.